In 1984, a novel about life in a small rural town in Georgia at the turn of the 20th century appeared in bookstores all over the country. Within months, Cold Sassy Tree had captured the imaginations of millions of readers. In fact, its success was such a surprise to Olive Ann Burns, the novelist, that she decided to plot a sequel. Unfortunately, she succumbed to cancer before she was able to finish, leaving Cold Sassy. Upon reading a novel, our first thought might not be, how would I turn this into an exciting opera? But luckily for us, the eminent American composer Carlisle Floyd did just that. He read a gripping yet sentimental tale and turned it into one of the most beautiful and refreshing operas that I've seen in a long time. We're here in Old Town at Heritage Park in front of the Gilbert House, the home of the San Diego Press Club. Today's subject is the opera Cold Sassy Tree. I'm Nick Reveles, and this is OperaTalk. American composer Carlisle Floyd was born in Latta, South Carolina in 1926. His father was a Methodist minister and was assigned to numerous small South Carolina parishes. This itinerant life for the young Carlisle was very influential in terms of the fact that he wrote so many operas dealing with small-town rural life in the Deep South. He studied first as a pianist, eventually attending Syracuse University and graduating in 1946. His first teaching post was on the piano faculty of Florida State University in Tallahassee. He took a master's degree at Syracuse a little later on, and this is when he began to become interested in composition. In fact, his first opera, entitled Slow Dusk, was performed in Syracuse at the university. His second opera was written when he returned to his piano teaching post in Tallahassee, and this opera was immediately withdrawn after only one performance. But the next opera was Susanna. This was a recasting of the story of Susanna and the Elders, the biblical story from the book of Daniel in the Old Testament. Susanna was a great success, not only at Florida State University, but with the young, scrappy New York City Opera, which decided that Susanna would be a wonderful work to premiere. Susanna had its New York premiere in 1957, and it was a tremendous success. The composer won the New York Critics Circle Award, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and many other prizes. And Susanna was chosen to represent the United States at the Brussels World Fair in 1958. Susanna is one of the most produced American operas in history. In fact, just about every professional company in the United States has performed Susanna at one time or another. It's fresh, engaging, its lyric, folk-like melodies are immediately accessible to audiences all over the world. It still is fresh, in fact, nearly 50 years after its premiere. After Susanna, Floyd was attracted to many other books as subjects for operas, including Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men, The Sojourner and Molly St. Clair, The Passion of Jonathan Wade, or other operas that he wrote. And one of his most important operas is certainly Willie Stark, based on Robert Penn Warren's All the King's Men. Throughout all of these works, we find lyric melodic writing in the middle of the 70s and 80s, when other composers were writing in a minimalist style or writing in an extremely avant-garde and terribly abstract style, a difficult style for audiences to get into. But Carlisle Floyd is a man of the theater. He knows what works on stage and what doesn't. He's also his own librettist, always writing his librettos, the scripts, as if they were straight plays first, and then later on putting them to music. This extremely careful work pays off emotionally in ways that other contemporary operas, other new operas, do not. The story of the opera centers around life in the small town of Cold Sassy Tree, Georgia. The year is 1900. The young man who narrates the story, Will Tweedy, tells us about his grandfather, Rucker Lattimore, who owns the general store in Cold Sassy. His wife, Mrs. Lattimore, has been dead for about 3 weeks, and he shocks the entire town and his family when he proposes to one of the young clerks in his store, one Love Simpson, who is young enough to be one of his daughters. The arrangement is supposed to be a business arrangement. He needs someone to come in and cook and clean for him and generally keep house. About halfway through the opera, he realizes that he's beginning to fall in love with Love Simpson. In a scene as touching as anything in operatic literature, Rucker Lattimore pours out his emotions to Love Simpson. She, in turn, tells him a story about something very painful from her dark past. Instead of turning away from her, he says, and I quote, "Then don't be company no more. Come share my room with me." "3 weeks after Granny Blakesley died, Grandpa came to our house for his early morning snort of whiskey as usual, and said to me, 'Will Tweedy, go find your ma, then run up to your Aunt Loma's and tell her I said, get on down here. I got something to say, and I ain't a-gun say it but once.' 'Yes, sir.' 'Make haste, son, I gotta get on to the store.' Mama made me wait till she pinned the black mourning band for Granny on my shirt sleeve, then I was off. Anytime Grandpa had something to say, it was something you couldn't wait to hear." A few words are in order about the life and writing career of Olive Ann Burns, who wrote Cold Sassy Tree. She was born in 1924 in Banks County, Georgia, on land that was cultivated by her great-great-grandfather. She was born to an interesting couple, William Arnold Burns, who later becomes the model for Will Tweedy, the narrator of the novel, Cold Sassy Tree. And the mother was Ruby Celestia Height, who was later to be the model for Santa Klein in the sequel, Leaving Cold Sassy. There were 4 children in the family, and they were a year apart, almost exactly. And you can imagine, for a family of 6 during the Depression era, living in the South, life was extremely difficult. In fact, they weren't able to make a living on the family farm in Banks County, and when Olive was about 8 years old, she moved to Commerce, Georgia, with her family, where she grew up. And Commerce, of course, is the town after which she modeled Cold Sassy Tree itself. She began keeping a diary at about the age of 9, but this was rather informal writing. She didn't begin writing seriously until she was in high school. She often told the story of being in her high school English class, and her teacher began teaching the class about similes, and she wrote the word violin on the board. And Olive Ann Burns' simile for violin was, "A violin sounds like a refined sawmill." She sincerely believed that those 7 words launched her writing career. In 1946, she moved to Atlanta, where her parents had moved from Commerce some years earlier, and soon landed a position with the Atlanta Journal-Sunday magazine, writing articles. Her editor there was the founder of the magazine, Angus Perkison, who had himself hired Margaret Mitchell, the author of Gone with the Wind, in 1922 for the very same magazine. It was here that she honed her writing skills, that Olive Burns began to understand how to organize a story, how to structure a history and a narrative, and she really learned how to write. She was with the magazine about 10 years, in fact, even marrying her colleague, Andy Sparks. At one point, she became the advice columnist for the magazine, which allowed her to stay at home and write and take care of her growing children. Now, this is a very important period for Olive Ann Burns' life because she joined a writers' club. This is something that grew up throughout the South in the wake of the success of Gone with the Wind. Writers' clubs, particularly clubs of women, appeared all over the South. This particular club was called the Plot Club, and it met weekly on the shady front porch of an eminent children's writer in the area. Few of the writers, who were all published, expected very much from Olive, and it took her quite some time to begin writing in earnest. Before the death of her mother in about 1970, she began writing down her mother's memories of growing up in commerce. And then, after the death of her mother, began talking to her father about family history, family stories. And slowly, the story of Cold Sassy Tree began to emerge. Cold Sassy Tree was 10 years in the writing. First of all, on a small typewriter in her basement, finally at the keyboard of a computer. And the writing of this work was constantly interrupted with her health problems. She developed cancer at one point, experienced 2 or 3 remissions, but there was always chemotherapy and radiation to take her away from the writing of the book. But finally, the publisher Ticknor and Fields picked up the book in late 1983, and of October 1984, the book was published. The release of Cold Sassy Tree was a phenomenon in the South, second only to the release of Gone with the Wind. There were rave reviews from all over the country, most importantly for Olive, in New York and Atlanta. It was not just that people were buying books for themselves, but they were buying multiple copies to give to their friends. Her editor, Katrina Kennison from Ticknor, often talked about Olive as being an extremely talkative, fascinating, endlessly curious woman with a great sense of humor. Even when debilitated by cancer and the congestive heart failure that finally took her in the summer of 1990, she was always positive and had that great sense of humor which infused the humor of Cold Sassy Tree. She was feverishly working on the sequel, Leaving Cold Sassy, which unfortunately remained unfinished at her death. The literary quality of Cold Sassy Tree has never been questioned. In fact, it's been compared to some of the other great stories of the South, like Huckleberry Finn, To Kill a Mockingbird, Gone with the Wind, The Color Purple, Tobacco Road. Those are great books to be companions with. Before her death, she was delighted that the New York Public Library listed Cold Sassy Tree as recommended reading for teenagers throughout the country. In fact, she said, "The New York list had my name right there between Emily Bronte and Willa Cather." Think of that. In order to put the novel Cold Sassy Tree into its proper Southern context, I thought that I would invite my good friend Dick Emmett, former circuit court judge in Montgomery, Alabama, and a Southern expert, also a playwright and dramaturg for various companies, theater companies here in San Diego, Diversionary Theater, North Coast Rep, the Old Globe, and various other wonderful organizations. Dick, welcome.
Thank you
for being here.
I'm looking forward to this treatment of the South.
Great. I'd like to start with the name Cold Sassy Tree. Explain to us a little bit where it comes from and...
Well, of course, it came out of Olive's mind to begin with, but it's typical of the South to have names like that for small communities. Mm-hmm. It was the coldest spot between where the Appalachian Mountains ended and the community known as Athens, the home of the University of Georgia, which is up in the northeast section of the state of Georgia. Mm-hmm. And they thought that that was the coldest spot, and it just so happened that it was a grove of sassafras trees. Sassy Tree is just the short name for a sassafras tree. And so they came upon the name Cold Sassy Tree.
It seems to me that all of these little towns have a pecking order and a class system in them. Does Olive Ann Burns get that just right?
Very, very much so. America today, we think that there are only 2 classes. There is the middle class, and then there is the lower class, and we refer to it as the socioeconomic class. Socio meaning the social aspects, and the economy being the commercial aspects. And in a commercial society, what kind of bank account you have puts you in the upper commercial class. But in an impoverished society such as is mentioned in the early 1900s in the state of Georgia, where there was little or no money, the social aspects of one's background becomes far more important. And then you begin to have so many variations between the more than just merely the middle class and the lower class. You have the upper class, and then you have various little distinctions there. And you have distinctions even in the lower class. You'll have the lower class, and then you'll have the upper lower class. And actually it ends up, you have 9 different levels in the pecking order of a Southern community. And it's so interesting, so many Southern writers really play very heavily upon those different orders, so that it's quite different from being a part of the upper class and being a member of the upper middle class. And one lords it over the other.
Let's talk a little bit about the wonderful tradition of Southern women writers. With the death of the sewing circles on the front porch, we have writers' clubs,
That's
very much
correct.
like the club that Olive Ann
Oh yes,
herself
they're all
belonged.
over the South. 5 or 6, sometimes as many as 10. Women will be a part, and they seem to be able to draw inspiration and artistic ideas from one another. They're usually very, very unselfish groups, and they're a very giving group of people. And I think you see this in this book, and you see it certainly in Olive Burns' real life. And I would recommend to people who are truly interested, and they will get a great deal more out of the opera if they will read both Cold Sassy and Leaving Cold Sassy. And you'll get a good idea of how a novel is put together, because in the tribute to Olive Burns, it is explained how she went about writing this novel. So it's an interesting study as well as a marvelous story to read.
Dick, thank you very, very much for being with us. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed being with you.
Well, that's the exciting orchestral opening of Carlisle Floyd's Cold Sassy Tree. It has that wonderfully piquant yet open and broad sound of the music of America. In fact, this rhythm that we hear in the second bar couldn't be anything but American. It's right smack dab in the middle of the tradition of middle American composers from mid-20th century, people like Roy Harris, Howard Hanson, George Gershwin certainly, and above all, Aaron Copland. What's interesting about this opening is that Floyd does something with it that Puccini did with La Bohème. You might think that that seems a strange comparison, but he opens the piece this way. Listen to how he opens the last act of the opera. Simply a variation of the way he opens the opera. It's a wonderful way of getting a kind of a circular structure to the piece. I'd like to debunk one of the classic complaints about contemporary opera, particularly contemporary American opera. I've talked to enough audience members who tell me, oh, we're going to have another American opera. I don't know. Perhaps I'll go because of the story, but you know, that music just doesn't have any melodies. Now, Virginia, nothing could be further from the truth. These pieces have great melodies, but we have to be used to listening to them. Another aspect of this is that we've been listening to Rigoletto and Aida and the Magic Flute for, in some cases, centuries now. We're familiar with the tunes. We just need to get familiar with the tunes in these wonderful operas. Carlisle Floyd is a marvelous tunesmith, and there are some beautiful melodies in this work. Let me play one of them for you. This is from the tenor aria. The character is Will Tweedy, who is the narrator of the entire piece and the grandson of the main character. He has fallen in love with a girl his own age in his schoolroom by the name of Lightfoot McClendon. And he turns to her in the first act and he tells her that she is his guardian angel. She asks him, well, what's a guardian angel? And he tells her in this beautiful aria. So there you were, my guardian angel, just like you'd been sent to me, sent to shield me, to protect me, to keep me safe from hurt or harm. It's a beautiful melody. It does all the things that a good melody should do in order to help us remember it, especially when it recurs in the drama. Don't ever tell me that there aren't beautiful melodies, not only in the works of other contemporary American composers, but certainly in the works of the master Carlisle Floyd. Now that you're more familiar with contemporary American opera, let me suggest some ways for you to get to know these pieces better. Unfortunately, we have no recording of Cold Sassy Tree, although as of the date of this airing, we've been promised recordings not only of Cold Sassy, but of Carlisle Floyd's other brilliant opera, Of Mice and Men. They should be coming along soon. In the meantime, the best thing you can do to prepare for this opera is to read the book. This brilliant novel by Olive Ann Burns, about which we've talked so much during this half hour. It's a great read, it's a fast read, it's funny, it's sad, sentimental, all of the things you want in a great Southern novel. There is a recording of Carlisle Floyd's earliest opera, and that is Susanna, in a brilliant recording starring soprano Cheryl Studer, baritone Samuel Ramey, and tenor Jerry Hadley, conducted by Kent Nagano. This is a wonderful recording of Carlisle Floyd's seminal work. There are also recordings available of Douglas Moore's rather folk-like American opera, The Ballad of Baby Doe. There is, of course, a wonderful recording with Beverly Sills in it, which is a little older than this one. This recording is, as well, brilliant. It's a wonderful example of Douglas Moore's great work for the stage. We can't forget, of course, George Gershwin's eminent Porgy and Bess. For an entirely black cast, this recording, conducted by Simon Rattle and his forces, is perhaps the best of the 3 or 4 complete recordings available. Finally, one of my favorite American operas, Mark Blitzstein's Regina. This particular recording stars Catherine Szynski as Regina Giddens. You may recognize that name because the opera comes from the play, The Little Foxes by Lillian Hellman, and it was brilliantly filmed during the 40s with Bette Davis in the role as Regina. This too is a wonderful American opera from the mid-20th century. So there's your start. You can get going on listening to these great American works as soon as possible, and I'm sure recording companies will be coming up with more wonderful examples of this particular operatic genre. Now, I know the San Diego Opera audience. I know that sometimes you're a little afraid of approaching something new. Yes, this is a contemporary opera, but I want you to understand that it's lyrical, there's beautiful melodies, it's a great story, and just like Of Mice and Men and The Passion of Jonathan Wade and Susanna, this is a gripping story theatrically. You'll really enjoy it. I look forward to seeing you there. I'm Nick Reveles, and I'll see you at the opera.